In 1938, on a quiet stretch of farmland in southeastern Australia, a farmer decided to lead his horses to a watering hole on the far side of his property. It was a routine task, one he'd done countless times before. But as he guided the horses across the wide-open field, one of his horses suddenly collapsed to the ground. The farmer worriedly rushed over, trying to figure out what could have caused the horse to fall. That's when he noticed a small hole in the ground, right where the horse had stumbled. Little did he know, this unremarkable opening would kill at least 16 people. The hole was only about a foot wide, but something about it caught his attention. He knelt down to take a closer look. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside the hole, he realized there was much more to this than he initially thought. About 10 or 15 feet below the surface was a vast pool of clear water, shimmering in the dim light. It was as if the earth had opened up to reveal a hidden world beneath his feet. Intrigued, the farmer hurried back to the stable and returned with a long measuring rope weighted at the end. He dropped the rope into the hole, watching as it descended further and further. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. The rope kept going, far beyond what he expected. It wasn't until it reached a depth of 120 feet that it finally touched solid ground. The farmer was astonished. He had just stumbled upon an enormous underground cave, hidden right beneath his land. What he didn't realize, however, was that the rope hadn't reached the true bottom of the cave. It had only touched the top of what divers would later call the rock pile, a massive underwater formation that descended another 300 feet into the depths of the earth. This accidental discovery was the first recorded encounter with what would become known as the Shaft, one of the most beautiful and deadly freshwater caves in the world. The cave got its ominous name because of the narrow entrance, a vertical shaft that plunges 18 feet down before opening into a vast subterranean lake. This entrance, the same hole that had caused the farmer's horse to stumble, became the only way in or out of this underwater world. For experienced divers, the shaft presents both a tantalizing challenge and a deadly threat. The entrance is so narrow that divers can't enter with their gear on. Instead, they must be lowered into the water first, with their gear following behind. Once inside, they must assemble their equipment while treading water, a nerve-wracking task in such a confined space. The cave itself is divided into 3 distinct stages, each more dangerous than the last. The first stage, from the surface to the top of the rock pile, at 120 feet, is relatively straightforward. Divers swim through clear sunlit water, guided by a safety line that runs from the entrance to the top of the rock pile. It's a serene and deceptively peaceful environment, but the dangers lie further below. Stage 2 begins at the rock pile, where divers must navigate down the steep slopes of this underwater pyramid. As they descend, the sunlight fades and visibility diminishes. There is no safety line to guide them in this section, so divers must rely on their flashlights to see through the darkness. The walls of the cave are lined with delicate limestone silt, and even the slightest touch can send clouds of sediment swirling into the water. This silt can quickly blind a diver, reducing visibility to zero and forcing them to navigate in total darkness. The western tunnel, one of the 2 main passages leading off from the rock pile, dead ends at 260 feet. The eastern tunnel, far more treacherous, descends steeply to 400 feet, where a feature known as the drop-off ledge marks the beginning of the 3rd and final stage of the cave. The final stage of the shaft, known as Stage 3, is where the true peril of this underwater cave reveals itself. This section begins at the 200-foot mark of the easterly tunnel, just beyond the drop-off ledge, and extends all the way down to the cave's deepest point at 400 feet. As divers cross the drop-off ledge, they leave behind the last traces of sunlight. The tunnel narrows sharply, constricting around them, forcing them to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. The walls are lined with sharp rocks and loose silt, and any contact can dislodge this silt, creating a blinding cloud that reduces visibility to zero. In this environment, even the most experienced divers can lose their sense of direction and become disoriented. As they progress deeper into the tunnel, the effects of nitrogen narcosis begin to set in. The symptoms of nitrogen narcosis are subtle at first. A slight dizziness, a feeling of euphoria, but they can quickly escalate into confusion, impaired judgment, and hallucinations. Divers have been known to mistake up for down, or to believe they are on the surface when they are still hundreds of feet underwater. Stage 3 is reserved only for the most elite and experienced cave divers, those who have trained for years and understand the risks involved. Even then, permission to dive this stage is rarely granted due to the extreme dangers it presents. In 1973, a group of 8 divers received permission to explore the first 2 stages of the shaft. They were explicitly told not to venture into Stage 3. On May 28th of that year, the group arrived at the field above the cave entrance, excited and eager to begin their dive. The group was composed of seasoned divers, including 3 siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine Malott. Alongside them were John H. Bockerman, Peter S. Burr, Larry Reynolds, Gordon G. Roberts, and Robert J. Smith. Each member of the group was eager and confident in their abilities, ready to explore the cave's depths. The group made their preparations, but in their eagerness, they made a critical error. Instead of using the special low-nitrogen gas mix required for such deep dives, they filled their tanks with regular air. This mistake virtually guaranteed that they would suffer from nitrogen narcosis as they descended. Unaware of the severity of their mistake, they geared up and began the dive. One by one, the divers were lowered into the shaft, followed by their equipment. They descended quickly, reaching the top of the rock pile in just a couple of minutes. There, they paused to take photos, capturing the beauty of the cave and the excitement of the dive. After a brief stop, they proceeded down the easterly tunnel, their lights cutting through the water as they approached the drop-off ledge. At the ledge, the group paused again, peering into the void of Stage 3. It was an abyss of blackness, the entrance to a world where few had ventured. Glenn, the eldest of the siblings, checked his air gauge and saw that his supply was running low. It wasn't an emergency yet, but it was time to think about heading back. As he turned to signal the others, something unexpected happened. Without warning, the other divers, including his sister Christine and brother Stephen, suddenly lunged forward, diving headfirst into the darkness of Stage 3. It was a spontaneous decision, one that none of them had discussed or planned. Glenn was stunned. This was not part of the dive plan, and they were venturing into a section of the cave that was off limits, incredibly dangerous, and utterly unknown. Panicked, Glenn dove after them, trying to catch up before they went too far. But as soon as he crossed the ledge, he was enveloped in total darkness. The silt kicked up by the divers clouded his vision, making it impossible to see more than a few inches in front of him. He realized that finding them in this pitch-black maze would be nearly impossible. Moreover, his own air supply was dwindling, and he couldn't afford to risk getting lost in the tunnel. He made the difficult decision to return to the rock pile, hoping the others would come to their senses and follow him back. But as he waited, the seconds ticked by, and there was no sign of the other divers. Glenn's air was now critically low, and he knew he had to leave if he wanted to survive. With a heavy heart, he began his ascent, leaving behind his siblings and the others in the unforgiving depths of the shaft. Meanwhile, in the darkness of Stage 3, the group of divers pressed on. They had no safety line, no clear path, and the tunnel was growing tighter with each passing moment. Soon they found themselves crawling on their stomachs, pulling themselves through narrow gaps in the rock. The excitement that had driven them into the abyss was now replaced by a growing sense of dread. They had ventured too far, and turning back would not be easy. The realization dawned on them that they were in a perilous situation. The tunnel was constricting further, the silt was blinding, and the effects of nitrogen narcosis were beginning to cloud their judgment. They were trapped in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable, deep within a cave that had already claimed so many lives. As the divers in the shaft's third stage began to realize the gravity of their situation, panic set in. They had ventured too far, and now their only hope was to retrace their steps back to safety. But the journey back would prove far more treacherous than they had anticipated. The tunnel, already narrow and constricting, was now completely silted out. Visibility dropped to zero as the loose limestone sediment kicked up from their movements filled the water around them. Larry, who was at the rear of the group, could barely make out Christine's fins in front of him as they tried to navigate their way back to the drop-off ledge. He knew that if he lost sight of those fins, he could easily become disoriented and lose his way in the pitch-black maze. Suddenly, the fins disappeared. Larry's heart raced as he realized he was now alone, swimming blindly in the silt-filled tunnel with almost no air left in his tank. He pushed forward, desperate to find his way back to the ledge, hoping that the others had somehow managed to make it through. Finally, Larry cleared the silt and emerged on the other side of the drop-off ledge. He frantically shined his light back up the eastern tunnel, expecting to see Christine and the others following close behind. But there was nothing. No silt, no divers, just an eerie silence. His air was running dangerously low, and he knew he couldn't stay much longer. But he also couldn't leave his friends behind. Driven by a sense of duty and fear, Larry turned around and dove back into the silted tunnel, searching for any sign of his companions. As he moved deeper into the darkness, he spotted the faint glow of flashlights moving erratically on the ceiling of the tunnel. It was Christine and another diver, Roberts. They were trapped inside a false dome, a dead-end pocket in the tunnel ceiling that looked like an exit but led nowhere. Larry tried to signal them with his light, but his flashlight suddenly went out, plunging him into complete darkness. Panic gripped him as he banged on the light, desperately trying to get it to work again. When it finally flickered back to life, he realized he had drifted further down the tunnel, away from the false dome. He looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of the others, but instead, he saw something even more alarming. Farther down the tunnel, barely visible in the distance, was another diver, John. His flashlight was pointed downward as he swam deeper into the cave, away from the group and away from safety. Larry knew that John was likely suffering from nitrogen narcosis, which had clouded his judgment and sent him in the wrong direction, toward the depths of the cave where escape would be impossible. Larry faced an agonizing decision. He could try to save John, knowing that it was almost certainly a suicide mission, or he could return to the surface and save himself. With his air supply nearly depleted, he knew there was no time left. Reluctantly, Larry turned back and swam toward the false dome, hoping to find Christine and Roberts and guide them out. But in the swirling silt, he couldn't find the entrance. Every second counted, and his air was running out. Realizing that he had no choice, Larry made the heartbreaking decision to leave them behind. He swam back to the drop-off ledge, pushing through the silt and the fear until he reached the rock pile. Grabbing hold of the safety line, he began his ascent to the surface. As he broke through the water, gasping for air, he looked around to see only 3 other divers had made it back, including Glenn, who was visibly shaken. Glenn immediately asked if Larry had seen his brother Stephen and sister Christine, or any of the others. Larry could only shake his head, unable to find the words to explain what had happened. The reality of their loss hit Glenn hard, but he wasn't ready to give up. With the last bit of air in his tank, Glenn turned around and dove back down, determined to find his siblings. He swam as fast as he could, praying that he would see them coming out of the tunnel. But the deeper he went, the darker it became, and still no one emerged from the abyss. Finally, with his air nearly gone, Glenn had no choice but to return to the surface, knowing in his heart that his siblings and friends were gone. In January 1974, nearly 8 months after the tragedy, a television crew filming a documentary on cave diving received permission to enter the shaft. While using professional lighting equipment to explore the cave, they made a chilling discovery. A body in a wetsuit, later identified as Stephen Millott, floating under a ledge at a depth of 50 feet. The body was recovered the next day by police divers. The recovery of the remaining 3 bodies was more challenging. On March 9, 1974, police divers led by R.G. Traynor found the bodies of Christine Millott and Gordon Roberts, lying one above the other at a depth of 185 feet, and the body of John Bockerman 20 feet deeper beneath a rock ledge. However, they were unable to recover the bodies immediately due to the murky conditions, and it took 2 more days of diving before Christine and Gordon were successfully brought to the surface on March 11th. The recovery of John's body, located at a depth of 215 feet, was the most difficult and was finally completed on April 9, 1974, nearly a year after the accident. The investigation concluded that all 4 divers died from lack of air, leading to terminal drowning. The coroner's report highlighted the lack of cave diving experience among the group and pointed to several critical safety failures, including the absence of a fail-safe return system and proper planning. The tragedy of these divers, who had pushed the limits of their experience and paid the ultimate price, serves as a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk in the depths of the shaft. The cave, once closed to divers, was reopened years later, But the lessons learned from this incident continue to haunt those who dare to explore its treacherous waters.